Thank you for being here. This is our College Scholar presentation. The College Scholar program is to highlight the research and efforts that our faculty do outside of the classroom, chance to showcase that. And tonight we have Deb Williams. Deborah Williams is a lifelong learner, interdisciplinary scholar, and career educator. She serves as professor and chair of the JCCC Department of Environmental Science and Sustainable Agriculture. Williams holds advanced degrees in anthropology, law, philosophy, indigenous studies, ecology, and evolutionary biology and education. In her dissertation called A Critical Approach in Analyzing and Addressing Worldview-Based Cultural Conflicts Between Indigenous Peoples and Western Science in Education and Research, she investigates barriers to Native American students' persistence in STEM and advocates for meaningful, necessary, and lasting changes through culturally responsive pedagogy and practice. Her recent publications reflect the eclectic nature of her research interests and include Artificial Intelligence, the Ontological Problem, The Last Real Man, Foreshadowing Men's Social Issues and Movements in Matheson's I Am a Legend, and topics relevant to her doctoral research such as Enhancing Artificial Intelligence with Indigenous Wisdom, which was the topic of her talk earlier this week, and it was recorded and it was really, really interesting, so check that out on our YouTube channel. And Indigenous Research Methodologies, Challenges and Opportunities for Broader Recognition and Acceptance. A popular pedagogical contribution, which is the focus of her community presentation, is Japanese Poems with Strong Nature Themes as a Tool for Environmental Education. And perhaps her most influential publication to date is Cultural Taboos as a Factor in the Participation Rate of Native Americans in STEM. And Deb, I thank you. You're a shining star representing lifelong learning and modeling that for everyone, our students, our employees, our faculty, our staff. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Well, I have a different mic. Can you guys hear me? So welcome, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. I was thinking as I was driving here, I think this is my 5th set of College Scholar presentations, and which made me think back to the original one, which was on my master's research in wolf ecology, legal and ecological issues shaping wolf ecology in the United States. And so I really appreciate the opportunity now as, again, an interdisciplinary scholar to talk about a very different topic, Japanese poems with strong environmental themes as a tool for environmental education. As like most things in life, things evolve, and my interests have evolved as a scholar and as a professor, and finding ways to keep things lively and interesting is certainly what this program showcases, as it invites faculty to talk about their research interests. And what I have done with this set of presentations is center things around the theme of culturally responsive pedagogy. And some of you were with me on Monday in the collab, where I presented the first topic, Enhancing Artificial Intelligence with Indigenous Wisdom. Tonight, again, I'm focused on Japanese poems with strong nature themes as a tool for environmental education. Both of these presentations are based on publications that you see cited here, and I invite you to take a look at those. They're in open access journals, and the easiest way to find them is to go to the ResearchGate site. I have my direct link there. And also you can, if you find me on LinkedIn, I add the publications that are open source to my profile. So I really do welcome your insights. If you would like to further have a conversation about any of the things that I write about, and of course tonight during Q&A. So again, if you were with me on Monday, I was talking about a very different topic. I'm switching gears a bit and talking about Japanese poems with strong environmental themes as a tool for environmental education. But probably the way to introduce this topic is to say, at least in my experience, we're in an age of infusion. As a scholar, as a professor at JCCC, I have infused global studies into my curriculum. I have infused Asian studies, Japanese studies. I've infused sustainability. And so it's a time really where there is an invitation and really a motivation, often grant funded and stipend incentivized opportunities for faculty to look at their traditional courses and find ways to bring these other ideas into their classes. So as an interdisciplinary focused researcher, and also as a person who in my own life, again, probably models interdisciplinary learning, I take that invitation seriously, and tonight's presentation is reflective of that. So traditional Japanese poems with strong nature themes are still relevant today as relatable statements of environmental consciousness. The presentation is actually a recap of a brief study of various elements of selected traditional poems, particularly the related aesthetic and philosophical perspectives of Wabi-sabi and Zen Buddhism, and the importance of nature and season with the goal of developing greater appreciation for their relevance and communicative power. To illustrate these concepts, related but otherwise independent poems are presented in several coherent groupings and analyzed scientifically almost with regard to Wabi-sabi, Zen terms, season terms, which you'll learn are Kigo, and additional nature terms. Again, the presentation in the paper underscores the value of multidisciplinary thinking, teaching, and learning. And again, as we think about popular messages surrounding the idea of bringing art into STEM, tonight I'm bringing STEM to the arts. So the value and appreciation of nature that's reflected in these century-old poems can be a useful tool for environmental education. I didn't come up with that idea. If you look, you can find that many national and international, and even NGOs, host websites, online web pages that facilitate their environmental education missions by hosting these online haiku pages. I think it's the universal appeal, the timelessness, and nature focus of Wabi-sabi and Zen perspectives that contribute to the continued relevance of these poems to developing environmental awareness and addressing contemporary concerns about the environment, including the intractable problem of climate change. The solution, of course, is unlikely to be found in the techno-scientific paradigm that created it. So a few definitions. Wabi-sabi is one of the core concepts and defining perspectives of Japanese culture. Philosophically, it's rooted in the acceptance and inevitability of the truth value of nature, including impermanence, imperfection, incompleteness, and the beauty of ugliness. Wabi-sabi is pretty difficult to define, in large part because of its mystery and its elusivity that are part of its aesthetic. The wabi is reflected in rusticity and has been described as containing notes of natural beauty, simplicity, and poverty, and it's the more philosophical of the two concepts. Sabi is concerned with time and its effects and is reflected in the patina of age, has been described as containing notes of loneliness, melancholy, sorrow, stillness, and tranquility, and is the more aesthetic of the two concepts. So here's a concept check. The picture at the top is wabi-sabi. The picture beneath is not wabi-sabi. So with respect to Japanese poetry, I have representative samples of different types in the paper and in my presentation. There's probably a little bit more in both with respect to haiku, but I give you a couple here on the slide to invite you to think about other forms. Tanka is primarily also about nature, but it regards the observer in nature as well. Haiku aims at significance. It does not aim to entertain or to educate. It just shows us what we already know, but importantly, to which we simply fail to attend. There are general conventions that apply to haiku. One is that it describes a single state or event. It's set in the present, and it refers to concerns of a particular season. Haiku are to be created, understood, and appreciated from the Zen point of view, with Zen as a matter of character, not a matter of intellect. So the Buddhist focus on the transience of existence was translated by Japanese into images of changing seasons. In Japanese poetry, the Kigo is the word, symbol, association that identifies a season. And some early Japanese anthologies even organize poems by a season. For example, a season may be identified by temperature, length of day, weather, changes in the land or landscape, festivals or other seasonal events, the seasonal behaviors of plants such as blooming flowers or falling leaves, or animals like nesting birds or migrating birds, and even human seasonal activities such as planting and harvesting. So words in these poems become data for analysis. And so what I've done in several of the slides that you will see is screen capture images from the paper itself, partially because there's a lot of content that exemplifies the message that I want to present, but hopefully also to intrigue you enough that you might want to read the paper. So table 2 here shows examples of essential identifiers that's used in Japanese poetry. And as you can see, this was generated by introducing these concepts on a spreadsheet. So you have spring, summer, autumn, winter in columns with terms associated with each of these seasons, and then they're sorted according to things like weather or astronomical and related events, plants, animals, activities, and other kinds of events like festivals or celebrations that track again with different times of the year, different seasons. So the seasonal and environmental terms for selected Japanese poems, again, are called Kigo. And here I've limited the presentation to plants and animals just for ease of presentation. But you see, again, I've highlighted a few things in red that will make more sense when I get to further slides. But I've been using throughout, without calling attention to it, images in the background that are blossoms, specifically cherry blossoms, which is a Kigo for spring. You'll see a reference to this phrase, which on the surface may not make a lot of sense to a non-Japanese perspective, but you'll see a slide that explains this coming up. And then frog, which I will feature in an upcoming slide. So again, the significance of some Kigo may be cultural, geographical, or historical, and so may be difficult for outsiders to appreciate without some research. So, for example, this phrase, cats in love, refers to the fact that sometimes cats mate in earnest from midwinter through early spring, and during that time, the male cats may emit loud wails in their searching for female. The word Kigo literally translates into season word, and it's a word or phrase associated with a particular season used in traditional forms of Japanese poetry. So again, the aesthetics and the philosophies of Wabi-sabi and Zen Buddhism as reflected in Japanese poetry with particularly strong environmental themes provide a vehicle for the communication with emotional appeal and facilitates reconnection with nature. As a result, Japanese poems articulate and strengthen what increasing numbers of Westerners intuitively feel about the natural environment and desire to, in the words of Basho, submit to nature and return to nature. Speaking of Basho, he was a lay monk, and his works reflect both Wabi-sabi and Zen. If you're familiar with a Japanese poet, it most likely is Basho. And if you're familiar with an ancient Japanese poem, it most likely is Old Pond. But here you see in Table 1, again, this is from the publication itself, the examples of various translations of this poem. From the original, which I won't attempt to read because I don't speak Japanese, and to the various interpretations across these columns, which both enhance perhaps and maybe complicate an analysis as the type that I am engaged in this project. So Cohen in 1972 interpreted the original as mossy pond, frog leaping in, splash. Hamill and Seaton in 2004 interpreted it as at the ancient pond, a frog plunges into the sound of water. Or the next one, old pond, a frog jumps in, the sound of water. To the final interpretation there, breaking the silence of an ancient pond, a frog jumped into water, a deep resonance. So all saying slightly different, having slightly different ways of saying the same thing. But again, words matter in interpreting their meaning. It occurred to me, as I was in the process of developing the presentation, that a potential approach to analysis might be to pair traditional poems with traditional Japanese woodblock prints. This occurred to me, obviously, way after I published the paper, but it occurred to me perhaps because recently I actually had another paper published that was derived from a final project in a graduate level woodblock print class I took at KU last spring. And so now going forward, you're going to see in my slides examples of how this might work. This particular image is Koi by the artist Kasamatsu Shiro, or Shiro Kasamatsu, and this happens to be one that I have in my own personal collection. So Basho, again, returning to our earlier discussion, Basho's poems, in this case, that are otherwise independent, I've arranged by seasons for analysis. So these poems existed in different locations within books that I was able to access, and I strung them into this column, separating them by the seasons to which their Kigo, sort them. And I've also paired them, as I mentioned earlier, with woodblock prints. This one happens to be Kosan's Crane on a Pine Tree, and the other is Hokusai, actually, cranes on snow-covered trees. And you might recognize Hokusai as from the iconic Great Wave, but he actually has some other very interesting and beautiful work. So a seasonal analysis of these 4 poems might proceed as follows. Develop a spreadsheet. In one column, put the actual poems themselves. And then in the headings of the columns for analysis, have in the headings the terms or the concepts that you wish to analyze. And so you can see here, if I'm analyzing these 4 poems for Wabi-sabi and Zen terms, I've highlighted in red the terms that stood out to me as being able to be associated with Wabi-sabi and Zen. So nesting storks viewed through branches of blossoms. Nesting is the Wabi-sabi term. Sometimes it may not be apparent that there's a term that's associated with a particular item that you're analyzing, but that's okay. You move on. On a withered branch, a crow has settled autumn evening. It's withered and evening that become significant for placing in the column for Wabi-sabi. The sea darkening, a wild duck's call, faintly white. So darkening, faintly, white. These are all terms that you can associate with Wabi-sabi and Zen. Moving right along, notice now that I'm focused on Kigo, and I've filled in the next column. And this time I've highlighted in red the terms that I've sorted out that are of significance to me in placing them in that column. So nesting storks viewed through branches of blossoms, it becomes storks and blossoms that are important for the Kigo analysis. And remember, you can go back to that summary table that has all of the associated events and seasons and animals and plants sorted. You can refer to that when you're classifying these significant entries in the poems in their respective Kigo column. On a withered branch, a crow has settled autumn evening. Obviously, autumn becomes the Kigo of significance. And then the sea darkening, a wild duck's call, faintly white. Wild ducks in general, are associated with winter, which is why that's indicated as such. This time I've paired my presentation with Wild Duck in the Snow, and this happens to be Hiroshige's work, which I think I love Hiroshige's work, so I have a few of those in this presentation, including this one. So a complete seasonal analysis of these 4 poems by Basho might look like this. This time again, the other column that hasn't already been mentioned is additional nature terms, and so now the term branches is highlighted and indicated in the last column. In summer rains, the crane's legs become short. Again, I didn't see a wabi-sabi term to enter, but I did have a season. a Kigo that was apparent, and also rains as a significant nature term. On withered branch, a crow has settled, autumn evening. You see branch is a term that hasn't already been claimed by the analysis. And finally, the sea, darkening, a wild duck's call, faintly white. Sea becomes the term that I place in that last column. In the paper, there are certain poets that are featured, and in the presentation, I only chose a few of them, but I have a summary slide that gives you a heads up of the others. Ryokan was also a Zen monk who happened to live in a one-room hut. He visited nearby villages and was begging for his food, which is in the Buddhist tradition. I have a quote here by a scholar that describes this as, "This self-imposed isolation and voluntary poverty of the hermit and ascetic provides opportunities for spiritual richness and the potentiality for the poetically inclined. This kind of life fosters an appreciation of the minor details of everyday life and insight into the beauty of the inconspicuousness and overlooked aspects of nature." So again, that's what you'll find in a lot of poetry, Japanese poetry, is if there is an undercurrent, it is to develop the ability to pay attention to nature, and certainly a lifestyle such as Ryokan lived would be helpful, according to this scholar, in doing so. So in table 4 in the article, Ryokan's poem, this is again a longer poem, is included, and this time I've paired it with Yoshitoshi's work, Ryokan with his bowl. But the poem is, "A single path through a dense forest, mountains peek out from between the floating mist, not yet autumn. The leaves have already disappeared, and without rain, the rocks are always dark. I gather tree mushrooms in a basket and draw spring water into a jar. Except for the stray traveler, no one finds their way here." So for the analysis, I set up my columns and put in the first column the poem itself. I sort by terms that are Wabi-sabi Zen, Kigo, and additional nature terms. And this time I show you how this actually progresses. So I have quite a bit in the first column. Single path, disappeared, dark, and the phrase, "except for the stray traveler, no one finds their way here," as Wabi-sabi and Zen terms. For Kigo, not yet autumn, when you have an actual season name, that's clearly a Kigo. So now that becomes significant to sort into the Kigo column. And then finally, for additional nature terms, there's still a lot that have not already been identified as associated with the two other columns. So dense forest, mountains, floating mist, leaves, rain, rocks, tree mushrooms, spring water, all become added to the additional nature terms. This is the heads up I mentioned earlier, and so just to show you, if you read the full article, there are other poets that are mentioned, and 8 total tables of poems that are collections of poems, often that are analyzed in different ways. And so as the heading indicates, one other approach may be to arrange and analyze the poems according to particular themes. So you've met Ryokan, Saigo, together they're presented in table 4, and Saigo, look at the dates. That's another thing to kind of think about is you could also think from a historical standpoint, sorting in that sense, but also makes the point, we've got one down here, that's 850 to 904. So you have really, when I say old, very, very old perspectives on nature as reflected in these poems. And you can see based on their little partial bios here, what their frame of reference might be. So Saigo was a warrior who became a Zen monk, and he was a traveler poet who also lived alone for long periods of time. And it's believed that he inspired Basho and Yakuran, who is mentioned later in my very lengthy, wordy slide. Soseki, was a Zen monk, teacher, calligraphist, poet, garden designer, And these are collectively, these three poets, including an emperor, happened to be the 92nd emperor of Japan. Their work is shown together in Table 6, and I've related them according to the theme of mountain settings, and also chose them in particular for the strength of their Wabi-sabi and Zen messaging. Table 7 was included to show that there could be a lighter side to the tone of some of these poems, and Kino Tamanori was probably the oldest, represented the oldest poems in the collection, was a Tanka poet during the Heian period in Japanese history. The final group, interestingly, included Gozan, which is a name you haven't seen yet, who's a haiku poet, and the second poem that you're going to see all of these reflects both the circle of life and transience of its stages, and importantly, things in bud and things in decay, the beginning and the ending of things, are actually more representative of Wabi-sabi and Zen than the full bloom, and because they better evoke that sense of transience. So here's Table 5, and again, you can see the poets that are featured in each of these. Deep in a ravine, in a tree on the old farm, a single dove sings out, searching for a friend, lonely voice of the evening. So just scanning down, again, themes like of loneliness or a setting like a mountain village. You can arrange things according to particular themes or emotions, if that is the desire as well. And then again, analyze them according to the ways that I have shown you in the previous examples. Here's the one that included the Emperor Fushimi, again, centered along the theme of loneliness. Autumn was prominently featured in this collection for analysis, and also the mountain setting. So the loneliness is not simply the result of autumn colors. Even mountain evergreens make me feel like autumn evening. Or call it loneliness, this deep, beautiful color no one can describe over these dark mountains, the gathering autumn dusk. Or only now I know the power greater than storms, a heart-rending awe, silencing all the pines at nightfall on the mountain. The last one, or actually second to the last, include themes that are actually more light-hearted, I suppose, compared to some of the others. Along the trail's edge, beside a sparkling river in the willow shade, I lingered to take a nap. Linger, and I'm still here. So you get spring, and willow is a Kigo, trail's edge, sparkling river, evokes a different kind of emotion than maybe some of the others. Sunlight so peaceful, radiant on the spring day, a heart not at rest, ah, the cherry petals have to be scattered so soon. And finally, again, those that have these themes that are very common in ecology and the cycle of life, you can find these represented with various familiar and maybe less familiar poets. I like this first one. Nothing in the cry of cicadas suggests they're about to die. It really engenders this idea of the circle of life, that in the vocalization of this insect, it's living fully, but there's nothing to suggest that an end, which is the end of a life cycle, is going to occur. And again, I've analyzed according to the three columns that I've consistently done throughout. So again, pairing poems and prints, going back to one that we saw before, Ryokan's poem, A Single Path Through a Dense Forest, mountains peek out from between the floating mist, not yet autumn, the leaves have already disappeared, and without rain the rocks are always dark. I gather tree mushrooms in a basket and draw spring water into a jar. Except for the stray traveler, no one finds their way here. So I found this really cool image, Road to Nikko. And this is another artist that I really like, Kawase Hasui, that I think could be a nice pairing. The only issue may be that the leaves have already disappeared, isn't apparent here, but this pathway and this lonely traveler, I think, is a nice complement as a visual piece to the written words of the poem. So again, the point of this is to try try to get folks to think about how Japanese poem is a tool for environmental education. And so I really want to underscore that that's not my original idea. In fact, as you can see here, I've cited several people who talk about the power of Japanese poetry to develop awareness and sensitivity to environmental issues. And you could read a really rich literature on this idea. As far as tips for using poetry as a tool for environmental education, don't reinvent the wheel. Because there's been so much attention paid to haiku in particular, you can see, I mentioned in the article, but also I have some additional sites that I can call your attention to where people have effectively already done this by hosting haiku competitions. There was one I found that, recently that was not included in the paper that was actually hosted by the National Park Service. And so this, it's mentioned down here on October 2023, the Climate Conservation Corps joined the National Day of Writing pop-up event. So they had this pop-up event and they had these kind of large posters that you could write and people from the public can kind of just wander in, and they incentivize them to write using prompts, particularly centered around climate change. And so the themes that they wanted people to think about included climate anxiety and climate hope. So you can see how something like this could happen at JCCC in the courtyard. You could just put up those large tablets with dry erase markers and watch students maybe have fun creatively responding to prompts. Also on this site, they had a word bank. And so that might be something to prompt your students if you wanted to use some of these techniques just to kind of get them going, thinking about terms that you've presented in class, or have them brainstorm terms that are associated with something that you're talking about in your course. So pairing haiku with Japanese prints. Obviously, that's something that just occurred to me. I would throw that out there as a possible way of using Japanese poetry and other art forms as a tool for environmental education, starting with a print or the poem and analyzing for seasonal terms, Kigo, like I've shown in this presentation. Starting with a print or a photograph, if you want to keep it even modern, pairing that with a poem that's been written or writing an original haiku might be a strategy. Providing the writing prompts or themes, creating the word bank, and using haiku, more importantly, as a means to more deeply attend to a setting or a location. For example, on JCCC campus, we have a campus pond that we access all the time in our environmental science classes. A campus prairie. I recently returned this past weekend, actually, from Kanza Prairie with a group of folks for the Flint Hills trip. Staff and faculty go annually to the Kanza Prairie. There are lots of motivations for possible poetry by just going to this site. Or during a study abroad trip. We have a study abroad program that goes to Japan. How cool would that be to have students on the trip write poetry as a result of something that they're experiencing on the trip, or an Earth Day event. And the list goes on. And I think various disciplines can weigh in as to how they might use this in their own classrooms. So interdisciplinary collaborations, workshops, module development, these are all techniques that we're familiar with as faculty members. So I just really encourage you to be inspired by what I had to say and what others have said centuries before me about the importance of tending to these themes in nature. Again, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. These happen to be specifically the sites that I mentioned in the published paper, which include national and international government agencies, NGOs, institutions of higher education. I hope in the future to see JCCC added to the list. The point is that all have created or hosted online haiku pages to facilitate their educational missions. And I've paired this now with Evening Snow at Edo River by, again, Hasui as the artist. Here are the ones that I found, and this time I included hyperlinks, which, by the way, if you want a copy of my slide presentation, I'm happy to share it, and you can click on the links and go to these sites directly. The National Park Service that's the actual site for that climate haiku pop-up challenge I just mentioned. Also, you can see, again, there's offices of education at different universities. I put this one in because, again, it also has a lot of resources, specifically on haiku writing, and there's even competitions. And really fascinating is they have an archive that goes back to the 70s that you can click on and see, again, what people were thinking about and writing about in a longitudinal manner. I've paired this slide with Summer, which was part of a series by Toshi Yoshida, and you can see his dates there. I'm getting close to the end, so I thought I would give some examples. And this one I pulled from the Environmental Protection Agency's website, and they were actually challenging K through 12 to write haikus that had environmental themes. And so this was Miss Anderson's 7th grade summer class who participated in combining poetry with science and nature. And so you can see their poems here, which I think is actually very, very, really good. A concrete jungle, this is my environment, hopeful for clean green. Tall trees to open sky, fresh air, and the river roars. Camp, a vague memory. Recycle, everyone. Trash takes long to decompose. Inspire generation. Or blue-red sky at dawn, warm summer breeze, cool dew, eyes open, waste, smog. So you can see how 7th graders have taken on the challenge and created these great haikus for this course, this classroom. So in conclusion, again, the poems featured in my presentation and many, many others that I didn't have time to present tonight, and many others that are referenced in the article, reflect centuries-old thinking about strong environmental themes, and my point is they're still very relevant today as statements of the value and appreciation of nature. In particular, the universal appeal and timelessness, the focus on nature of wabi-sabi aesthetic, I think contributes to their continued relevance today, and also their applicability to contemporary environmental concerns like climate change. Also, we've seen in the last 50 years an increasing interest in Basho. Many scholars have pointed out that there's an interest, a kind of a resurgence in looking at these writings. Poets, nature writers, even environmental philosophers are looking at these old works. Teachers have also recognized the power of Japanese poems to develop sensitivity to environmental issues. And so, again, the ultimate goal of environmental education is the cultivation of an attitude that will enable the person to function in harmony with the environment. I think about Aldo Leopold's land ethic, and at the end of the article, one of the things he cautions us about is that we have problems with attitudes and implements. So developing and cultivating the right attitude and then implementing that attitude, we can relate it even to some common resources that we use in our environmental ethics or environmental science, environmental philosophy courses. The writing of a haiku is an experience that could aid in the formation of ecologically oriented attitudes, primarily because it helps people pay attention to what's happening in their experiences with nature. Haiku actually wants us to record and encourage encounters with real animals and real plants rather than just having conversations about abstract ideas and discussions about abstract categories. Zen is important because it has a place in helping us understand and address our environmental ills, even the koan of climate change. And so that's simply a paradox to be meditated upon that's used to train Zen Buddhist monks to abandon ultimate dependence on reason and to force them into gaining sudden intuitive enlightenment. So with that, I will thank you for your time, and if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
So it's been a long time since my 7th grade haiku writing assignment, and so I can't remember the exact meter that makes up a formal haiku. But I was just wondering if the Basho poems that you that you read and then translated the different versions of, were the shorter ones actually haikus? And I'm just wondering if the translation is different and doesn't fit into that meter, is it still considered a haiku?
You know, that's a great question. It was something I was thinking about because in my research, I wasn't really finding a directive. I think we have in kind of Western experience, and I wish there was somebody who taught literature and poetry that could maybe inform me or correct me on what I'm about to say. But in my thinking, I referenced some things that are typical in writing haiku, but the 5-7-5 seems to be a Western convention. When you think about it, for the reasons that you just mentioned, words and the translation of words, something that might be monosyllabic in Western language, maybe multi-syllabic in other languages, so you're probably not going to nicely fit that formula anyway. But I've seen, at least in the examples and the websites that are hosted, at least the convention of trying to adhere to that with the English language.
While I have the microphone, I just have one more question. I know that in European art, there was an emphasis on nature in response to the Industrial Revolution and all the construction in cities and so forth, in an effort to kind of bring nature inside. And I was just wondering, Asian art is not necessarily my forte, and I was just wondering, as you studied these prints, if there was something similar to that compelled these Japanese artists to focus so much on nature, or do contemporary Japanese artists still focus on nature, or what was that motivation?
You know, I think I'm going to answer that first from the lens of an ecologist. What I thought was fascinating, I'll go back to it here just to make the point, in this very wordy slide, you see a lot of dates associated with artists, and very old dates, and relative to today, but different time periods represented in the periods of the history of Japan, let's just say. And a lot of different things are happening. In fact, I have a slide at the end that I can pull up that actually sorts out the different periods of Japan, just to remind myself, what were some of the key events happening at the time that actually might be the prevailing concerns, just like now, we talk about climate change or we're post-pandemic, and how those might influence our thinking and life experiences as a result. But from the ecologist lens, I would basically say that people have an innate biophilia, a love of life. And I think if a person in 850 to 904 was inspired by nature, and a person in 1100 or even in contemporary times, I think that's maybe something about the common thread of humanity, as much as events in time and place and history, that's inspiring. Not to say that time and place, which I tell my ecology students, environmental science all the time and place is everything in the study of ecology, but in human kind of experience, sometimes I think we just have to look at our core nature. And these poems, no matter how you analyze them or if you analyze them at all, organically are beautiful, and we can appreciate them on their face for what the poet is saying to us. I think the same holds true for a lot of these beautiful woodblock prints, that whatever motivated the poet or the artist can speak to us, can function in ways that are just purely aesthetic, but we can also see, if we want to and look for, other ways in which we can use those as a teaching tool. Thank you for the question.
Actually, I have a couple of them, but I think you really anticipated. The first one I wrote down was about other art forms and environmental education besides Japanese poetry, and I was thinking about visual arts, and so you anticipated that by including those woodblock prints. But I thought it's interesting because I know that in your infusion projects, besides sustainability and Asian studies and Japanese studies, you've done a lot of work with Native American studies also, and in your research in anthropology and other things. So I just thought, have you thought about kind of a similar project, but using Native American arts or other traditions and things like that. I think you could have a whole series of works on environmental education and how traditional art forms, both visual and written or musical or things like that, could be inspirational.
Absolutely. And it's funny that you suggested that, because I was recently invited to give a guest lecture for a course that's offered here by Allison. And that might be something that I play with a little bit. It's an art class, which isn't my background, but some of the things that might be what I could bring is to an audience that's interested in Native American culture and art is something like this, and just pull up some pieces and look at ways of analyzing it scientifically, which is my area, and environmental in particular, and see what we can do with that. That might be fun. So I love the suggestion.
So my second question was, and again, you kind of spoke with some examples of how this could be used in different classroom settings, but have you done this in your own classrooms with your environmental science students, either having them analyze poetry or write poetry? And what were your kind of results? Was it successful? Were they comfortable doing that? I could imagine that students coming into a science classroom could be pushed a little bit out of their comfort zones if you're asking them to analyze poetry or art or write poetry. So have you tried that, and what was the reaction?
I have not personally tried it in my classrooms. I mean, the closest that I have done to something like that is nature journaling, which was highly successful, very, very positively received, and also something I really appreciated is to see what students, picked out as part of what they wanted to reflect on by having an encounter with something that was on the agenda as a lab experiment that ultimately turned into something that they could kind of freely reflect on in the form of a journal. I do in my activity, we probably won't have time to do the activity, but I wanted to show you something that might work. So here's a possible activity. You take something that's iconic like the Great Wave, and in this little blue box, if I take it into presenter view, it's a text box. And what I was going to suggest is we as a class develop a haiku based on this iconic work. So I did this, I signed myself to do this, and this is what I came up with earlier this morning. Wave approaching, looming forcefully above, outside looking in. Okay, you might do this this is a Sacred Grove. This was a piece by Toshi Yoshida. That was the focus, actually a juxtaposition of this piece and the Great Wave, and the piece that the article that just published earlier this week. Again, a text box. I would invite you guys to possibly develop a haiku in response to this. This is what I came up with. Ancient trees embrace frightened children of the sun, inside looking out. Okay, this is one you saw, one of my favorites in the presentation, Road to Nico. Text box, we could take some time to develop this. This is what I came up with. Lonely traveler, counting footsteps until home, winding path ahead. So you can do this, and you can do this, quickly and easily. And I would encourage you to think about doing that.
Any more questions before we start writing our haiku?
All right, thank you so much. It was a pleasure.